It's a great honor to introduce to you today an extraordinary individual whose life and career have been a testament to the pursuit of peace. Emma Sky is not just a distinguished scholar and author. I think she is an exemplar of resilience, of the most challenging and complex environments in the world. So Emma's remarkable journey is probably best encapsulated in the book here, The Unraveling. There's the Chinese edition, but it's in the simplified character. I hope that we get a Taiwanese edition here as well. It's called The Unraveling, High Hopes and Missed Opportunities in Iraq. So only when you look at things and tragedies from hindsight, you see where the lost opportunities were. In this book, she provides a compelling narrative of her experiences in Iraq, where she served as a political advisor to the American military. It is within these pages where I find an anecdote that highlights the essence of her career and the impact she has had on the ground. One particular story stands out in my memory after I finished the book. In the early days of the American occupation of Iraq, Emma found herself in Kirkuk, which is a city, a province or a city in a province in Iraq. This place was on the brink of chaos and sectarian violence, so it was a very dangerous place. And amid the turmoil, she made it her mission to bring together leaders from different ethnic and political and religious backgrounds to foster dialogue and cooperation. So in those circumstances, I remember during one such meeting, tensions were so high and the disagreement threatened to derail any progress at all. And this kind of thing we know because it happens in our parliament every day. Emma, with her very typical calm and determination, she proposed a simple yet very powerful idea. That is to listen to each other's stories. So she invited local leaders from all different backgrounds to share their personal stories with one another, and especially the pain and suffering of their families and their communities. So this act of sharing, of opening up to one another, created an unexpected bond among the participants. They began to see each other not only as enemies, not just as enemies, but as fellow human beings with shared suffering. Actually, they suffer so much, and a common desire for peace and future. So that anecdote showcases Emma's ability to transcend divides, to bring people together through empathy and understanding. And by so doing, inspire change through dialogue. In other words, her work in Iraq was not just about political strategy. On the surface, it was, but actually deep down, it was really about human connection and the belief that even in the darkest of times, there is a path to reconciliation and hope. And I think exactly this holds a very, very timely and special meaning for the people, for Greater China, for the people across the strait today. There is a very special meaning. And especially when opportunities are there, you have to be able to see them as opportunities and seize the time. And so I appreciate very much Emma made this visit. Ladies and gentlemen, so I don't waste any words. Let's welcome Emma Sky. Yeah. Okay. I'll begin with the simple question. Emma, we love foreign visitors to love Taiwan, you know. You have, actually, this is only the second time you're in Taiwan. And then, but then you have been so engaged with the situation with the people here. And during this visit, which is only 1 week, you have met a lot of people. You have been to Jinmen and also crossed the strait to Xiamen. So I think you have had a lot of impressions. So would you share with us a little bit about your engagement in Taiwan, your impression, and the most recent observation, perhaps?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that introduction. And it's really a great honor to be back again in Taiwan. So this is my second visit. And I was here first time almost a year ago. And my first visit really had a big impression on me. You read about coming to Taiwan and it says, this is the most dangerous place on earth. And I was like, wow. You know, I've been to some dangerous places and I'm going to the most dangerous place on earth. So when I turned up here, I expected to see lots of people in military uniform. I expected to see a high level of readiness and people bristling and nervous and anxious. And I'd been invited for a tabletop exercise with some people who are here today. And it was all very, very interesting and not what I expected. And so I decided I was going to travel around Taiwan and have a look for myself at what is this place called Taiwan. So I got on a train and I went down to the Toriko Gorge, and then I was on a motorbike, and then I was down in Taitung and I went swimming in the Pacific and coming back up the western side of the island. I visited lots of Matsu temples. There are a lot of temples in this country. And I thought I must have visited about 10, but that's probably a very, very small amount. And everywhere I went, I just thought, wow, what a beautiful island. It's really blessed. You've got, you know, very fertile land. You've got lots of rain. You've got these really like great people who are very welcoming. It all seems great. But things really stuck in my mind. Because, you know, when you look at the rest of the world, we've all been through COVID, and we're all living with these rising geopolitical tensions. So everywhere else in the world, people are looking to secure supply chains, to de-risk, to get to net zero. Young people around the world are passionate about climate change, and all this action is going on. And yet what I discovered during my visit to Taiwan was that 97% of energy is imported. 2/3 of food is imported. And water, well, water was looking not so good. The reservoirs are not full to capacity. And in fact, yesterday they had the opportunity to go to Ximen Reservoir, where I met Professor Li there, and discovered that that reservoir is only at, I think he said, 38% capacity. And so all of these things have really struck in my mind, because when I look at Taiwan, it made me think much more about how people could be working to reduce their carbon footprint, how to get to net zero, how to create a circular economy. And I'm a big fan of an economist called Kate Raworth, who writes about donut economics, the circular economy. And thinking more about all of this, and then talking to Minister Li, Professor Li, who had spoken to monks and spoken to people on the pilgrimage, the Matsu pilgrimage, and sort of challenge people to think more about what they wear, what they eat, how to deal with the waste, the transport, an individual's carbon footprint, how to get to net zero, how the offerings could be, carbon offsets, carbon credits. And this really has made me think much more about, as an individual, how can you reduce your carbon footprint? As a group, how do you organize to lobby government? As government, what policies to adopt? How to get public support for policies? And so for me, when I think about Taiwan, I think of a place that's really renowned for its digital democracy, the platforms that it's invented, such as Polis. And so why I wanted to come back a second time is really to throw the challenge out there to all these really bright techies in Taiwan, is how do you create peace gaming? So peace gaming that actually looks at cooperation. If you think of war gaming, you think much more of zero sum, whole of government. If you think of peace gaming, you think of whole of society. How do you set those incentives to encourage cooperation? Because the challenge of global warming requires all of us, each one of us as individuals, to do more. It requires us to mobilize, to make demands of government. It requires government to come up with the policies. So that's what I've been thinking of, and that's why I came back. And I hope there's people here with lots of bright ideas of how you think about cooperation. And I was thinking, in every village in Taiwan, in every town, in every city, and for the island, what could be done to bring people together, whether you do it analog in person or whether you do it online virtually, that you actually come together to discuss and agree how to create a circular economy at all different levels. So that's what I've been thinking about during my visit to Taiwan.
To go back a little bit, Emma, when you were in your early 20s, a very young woman, you already went to Israel and Palestine and Gaza. You worked there as a very young person. And at that time already you were experiencing, you were witnessing hostilities, conflict, and the situation in Gaza, the way people live. And in your 30s, you were in Iraq. It was even more drastic. You saw how a country, actually a state, failed and collapsed. So my question for you is, your emphasis on the issue of resilience today, there must be a path. You went through those conflict zones, you saw ruins, you saw the Iraqi society really disintegrating into nothing and trying to rebuild. So how did your concept and your commitment to resistance come through this path of your personal growth?
So when I was a student at Oxford, and as a young person looking for what's my purpose in life, how am I going to spend my career? And I was a student undergrad at Oxford, and it was the end of the Cold War, a really incredible time. It was the time that the Berlin Wall came down and West and East Germany were united. It was a time when Nelson Mandela was released from jail and the end of apartheid. And it was also the time of the start of the Middle East peace process. And I decided I was going to dedicate my life to trying to end conflict in the world. It's funny now, but I think at the end of the Cold War, in the 1990s, we really believed that all the conflicts of the world would be resolved. And so I focused on the Middle East. And I went out and I worked in Jerusalem for most of the 1990s. And this was a period when the Oslo Accords were signed. And there was a belief that the way to end conflict between Israel and Palestine was to create two states for two people. And I felt as an individual that I could come and I could contribute to that. And so I focused my efforts on helping to build up the institutions of the Palestinian Authority. There were lots of donors who wanted to help build up those institutions to prepare the Palestinians for statehood. And I did a number of initiatives which brought Israelis and Palestinians together. Sometimes I took them on trips to Northern Ireland to look at that experience and to learn about each other. So it really was this very hopeful period. When I reflect back at the beginning of that time, it seemed inevitable that it would lead to two states for two people. But there were those who opposed this deal, and they sought to derail the peace process. And one of the key leaders of the time was the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Now, Yitzhak Rabin was a military man, a general, a retired general, a former chief of staff of the army. And he had come to the conclusion that the future of the Jewish state, the state of Israel, actually depended on coming into existence of a Palestinian state. So he truly had reached that conclusion. And he had helped pull public opinion in Israel towards that. So helped convince Israelis that not to fear, but to go towards their hopes. What was the hopeful, optimistic future that they had? And he built that vision, and he led public opinion in that direction. Now, there were people who opposed to that process, and they sought to derail it. But the public rallied behind the Prime Minister, and there was this big peace rally that was held in Tel Aviv on the 4th of November, 1995. And I was one of those young people who went to Tel Aviv for that night. 200,000 people rallied to show support for the peace process and to urge the Prime Minister to move forward with it. And he got up on the stage and he sang this song, the Song for Peace. And you can watch video clips of it, because he was there with all these famous singers, and he had a really bad voice, and you can hear his bad singing voice coming over. And at the end, he got off the stage and he walked to his car. And a Jewish extremist walked up to him and shot him dead, because this extremist believed that no human being, no man, could give up the land that God had promised to the Jews. And it was a real shock to me. It was a real shock because leadership matters. And leadership has that ability to help build up a vision and to take people towards that future. And after his assassination, extremists on both sides sought to torpedo the peace process and succeeded in torpedoing it. And what we have today is the outcome of the failure of that peace process. And you can see the horrors that happened on the 7th of October when Hamas broke through the fence of Gaza and killed 1,200 Israelis and kidnapped over 100. And you can see in the Israeli response, which has been disproportionate, the 30,000, 35,000 Palestinians who've been killed. And that is a result of the failure of politics and the extremists on both sides, extremists in the Israeli government and the extremists in Hamas. So leadership matters. Moving forward to Iraq, where I served from 2003 to 2010, I got to see in Iraq many different things. I got to see what happens when a state collapses, when people lose hope, and when people turn on each other. At the beginning in Iraq, there were those who, after the coalition invaded, we dismissed from their jobs and humiliated them. And they were the ones who took up arms and sought to oppose the occupiers. And then there were those who collaborated with the occupiers, who could see this was a way to, social mobility, to improve their social status. And eventually it became Iraqis fighting each other. And for a lot of the time, we didn't understand the conflict, and we didn't understand how to end the conflict. But I think about the year 2007. It's a year that we refer to as the surge. And at the beginning of this year, Iraq was a complete disaster. The civil war, the sectarian civil war, had been raging. And every day, there were dead bodies in the street. And you could tell whether they were Sunni or Shia, depending on whether they'd been killed by a bullet through the head or a drill. And President George W. Bush decided to appoint new leaders and to send new troops. And that's why we call it the surge. But perhaps the most important thing about the surge was the surge of new ideas, how to understand what was happening in a different way and to respond. And I was the political advisor to the generals in charge of the surge. And the first thing was to understand the nature of the violence. Why were Iraqis fighting? What did they want? And could we get them to give up violence? And so we pushed soldiers to live back out amongst the Iraqi population, to protect the Iraqi population from the extremists, from the insurgents. And by living among the Iraqis and protecting them from the insurgents, the military gained the trust of the Iraqis. And by reaching out to insurgents to try and understand them better, we convinced many of them to swap sides, to turn against Al-Qaeda in Iraq, to become what we call the Sunni Awakening, the Sons of Iraq. And by working with the Iraqi security forces, we strengthened their capacity and helped them win the trust of the Iraqi population. And this led to the Iraqi population rejecting the Shia militias and saying, we've had enough of armed groups, we've had enough of militias. And so we saw that all different groups came into the political process. People who had been insurgents stood as candidates for election. And people who had boycotted elections before actually turned out in their masses. And the civil war came to an end. And so this was another example where, with the right leadership, the right vision, and the right resources, violence was brought to an end. So those are my two examples.
A little bit back to Jerusalem and Gaza. Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated in 1995. About 2 years before that, the whole world saw Arafat from Palestine and Rabin from the Jewish state. They shook hands on the lawn of the White House, and the whole world thought there is a chance for peace. I went there after the handshake. So we were probably walking on the street at the same time in Jerusalem and Gaza. my question for you is this, exactly because in 1995, you had witnessed the dissolution of the peace accord, the assassination, and the disintegration of whatever effort that went on before. And then 30 years later, that's today, we saw what's happening in Gaza and in Israel. My question is this. If you look at this event, exactly what's happening now, 30 years ago and 30 years later, what is it that keeps you hopeful and you're still working on peace building? What is it that you think is going to work? Exactly when we look at this, what's happening 30 years back and 30 years now. What is it keeping you going?
When you look at the situation, it's deeply tragic. And you think of all the loss of life. You think of the children whose parents are killed, the trauma they've suffered, and what sort of people would they grow up to be, wanting revenge. And you think of all the people who stand against peace, all the people who go towards fears, who fear-monger. And it's easy to get disillusioned. But I have found through my experience of war, of loss, of tragedy, that you try and make some sense out of it. And I've lost many people I was close to in these wars. And so what do you do? What do you, those who are alive, what's your role? And I think like many people who've served in war, you take the memories with you of those who are dead, those who don't have the chance to live their lives, and you look at what you can do with your life. And it's important that you take those memories and you commit to making every day count. You commit to living life to the full, to serving others, to helping bring about a better world. I think of my colleagues who served, who dreamt, who died, and I honor their legacy by trying to make the world more peaceful, by living the life they can't live, and by making sure that every day I'm thinking, how do I contribute to something bigger than self? How do I contribute to making the world a little bit better? And I think that's something that each one of us can do, and it's what keeps me going, and it gives me meaning in life.
Well, yeah, disillusionment is something that you have to fight against, I guess. I was sitting in the Jerusalem parliament, and I watched Prime Minister Rabin walk on stage and give his speech. And he was saying, he was defending the accord. He was saying that I don't want to see more mothers cry, okay? And then came Netanyahu giving his speech. And Netanyahu gave the speech 3 times the time than Prime Minister Rabin. And yet Netanyahu, that was 30 years, exactly 30 years back. And he was saying, we have to protect ourselves and so on. So for me, it's a shock, and it's not easy to fight disillusionment either. And then you are doing that very well. You keep going. Okay, so in connection with this, I think many of us here, we are living under the shadow of conflict, of what's possible, the dark cloud over our head. And I think, and most of the people here have also listened and read what you said about, well, to deal with a conflict, resilience is a very important part. However, for example, when you were standing on the ruins of Iraq after the war, how do you make the connection? Why? Okay, we are faced with the possibility of a breakout of war. How is that related to resilience with water problems, energy problems, with our land problem, all that? How do we connect war, avoiding war, or gearing up for war, and climate change? How do you connect these two?
It's about building a peaceful world. It's about working together and cooperating together. When you think of the aftermath of World War II, all that death and destruction, and even while the war was going on, you had Roosevelt, Churchill meeting to discuss the future world order, how to build a world order where people aren't fighting, where you create institutions that bring people together. And it was out of the horrors of World War II, the millions killed, the death and destruction, that they built, or they conceived of the idea of a rules-based international order where might isn't right. They looked at building the United Nations, looked at the World Trade Organization, the World Health. So in every area that you can think of, from aviation through to finance, there were mechanisms created for collaboration, for cooperation, to bring people together. And I think when you look now, we're in a different world. We're really in a changing world order. And it was Gramsci who said, you know, the old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born. Now is a time of monsters. And I think that's the age that we're in now. In this world that we're, you know, the old world, which is America's unipolar moment, is coming to an end. And we're moving into this multipolar world. And this world is a bit chaotic at the moment. And people talk a lot about great power competition. But we shouldn't lose sight of great power cooperation, because a lot of the issues that we're faced with don't know borders. And climate is probably the biggest one of all. It doesn't know borders. It affects us all. And so I'm based at Yale, and I teach a class on great power competition and cooperation. So we spend part of the semester trying to understand what is changing in the world. And then the second half of the semester, we look at cooperation. And I set the students an exercise, a Summit of the Future type exercise. And there they are tasked, they're international, my students, and they're tasked as representatives of their country. And there'll be Russians and Chinese and Americans and middle powers as well. They're tasked with working out what should be the policy of their country, how it can contribute to combating climate change. And so they work on their own policy, and then they meet with the other countries, and they have to negotiate an agreement. And what I've noticed is when you actually task them to find agreement, not to defeat, not to beat, but actually find common cause, I'm always impressed by what these young people do. And climate has been the key one, that they come together and they look at what they can do. And I'm always pleasantly surprised and hopeful as a result of that, because climate change is affecting all of us, all across the world.
So the way you teach geopolitics to your international students, if you would translate that into our situations here between the Chinese students and the Taiwanese young people, how would you translate it into our context here? What do you suggest to be done here?
Well, I'm talking locally. So people individually, and a village level, and a town level, and a city level, could all be working together to try and deal with climate change, to try and create that circular economy, to try and de-risk and make Taiwan more resilient. All countries are doing this. It's a sensible thing to do at an individual level. It's a necessary thing as an island, and it's a definite necessary thing for all of us as citizens of the globe. If we don't address climate change, our planet won't be inhabitable next century for human beings.
Are you saying to defend ourselves against the calamities of climate change is even more significant and urgent than defending ourselves against military conflict from China?
I'm talking about peace. So I'm talking about how do you create that resilience so you're building a peaceful society, you're coming together as a community, you're protecting Mother Earth, and you're creating a sustainable way of living. We all need to be doing that. The world is changing rapidly. It's on all of us to do that. You know, I just came from a trip to Beijing before I was here. And there I was doing a couple of events on climate with Yale World Fellows and Yale Climate Fellows who work in that area. And to see the air in Beijing now, to see how clean the air is, to see the improvements that have been made on water, to see the levels of electric vehicles that you see on the roads. Big strides have been made. And so to see these climate activists working with other climate activists from all over the world is something that all of us should be doing.
Emma, you spoke of cooperation instead of only competition, right? Especially between great powers. How do you think it's to be done? Because the underlying premises of debate or discussion is that trust must be established before reaching a consensus or resolution on issues like climate change, green growth, or AI regulations. However, dealing with conflicting parties, entrenched in animosity and sometimes even hate, how can trust be cultivated? How do you start?
You know, I'm the director of an international leadership center, and our mission is to develop adaptive, innovative, effective leaders to address the key challenges facing the world. And one of the initiatives that we have, the Yale World Fellows, every year we advertise internationally, and you know, we're looking for real superstars who are dedicated to making the world a better place, who are leaders of the good society. So we get thousands of applicants, and each year we select 16. And we bring them to Yale for a 4-month semester. And during that semester, you think these are all superstars? We could get them competing against each other for resources, for glory, for fame. But we deliberately create an environment in which we incentivize cooperation, in which they each help each other become their best self, in which they all see that their success is enhanced by the willingness to work with others. And you know, cooperation requires trust. And if you spend that time getting to know each other, then you learn that what unites us is far greater than what divides us. And so this thing of listening, of working together to develop a shared vision, and actually when you meet people and you talk about the world they want to live in, it's quite surprising, or not surprising, that most young people have a vision that's quite similar. People want to live in a world that's safe, that's prosperous, where they as individuals can flourish, where the environment is looked after. And I think of World Fellows as a microcosm of the world. It's possible. And I'm a big fan of an American called William Ury, who wrote a book, Getting to Yes, and he's got another book out now just called Possible. And he writes about the importance of going to the balcony, so zooming out. And I think of my center like a balcony. People come and they spend time there, and they can zoom out and gain a broader perspective of the world, engaging with people from all different walks of life, all different backgrounds. And I also think of my center as a training ground for people to think really creatively with others about, you know, what's the world that you want, how to get there. So what's that optimistic future, and what's the golden bridge that you build to it? And William Ury also talks about a third side. So the third side is not a party that is part of the conflict, but a third side, which we see ourselves as, is we host, we convene, we provide fellowship and friendship, we mobilize our network in support of peace. So I think of all of these ways of building trust, and a lot of it is the personal connections, making time to understand others, working together to try and build a more peaceful future.
Let me go back to July last year, which was the time when you made the first visit to Taiwan. And interestingly, we met in this building, and actually on the same floor, the same space, because the war games organized by Admiral Chen, now a parliamentarian. I recall actually that war game organized by Admiral Chen was divided into something like 8 areas. Only one of the 8 subjects was military maneuvers. All the other 7 covers energy resources, covers medical supply, covers transportation, and so on. And now learning about peace gaming through the conversations with you, and I think back of that war game from July, I realized that, well, actually that is a kind of a resilient game and a kind of peace gaming. Would you say a little more about this? Because we took part in that as well.
Yes, I mean, we were both at that event, and from that event, it made me think much more about how you bring whole of society together. So how do you bring people at a local level in their villages to work towards how you get to a circular economy, how you address climate change, and what more can be done. And so it's how you cooperate. There are going to be trade-offs. There are lots of vested interests. If you think of, like, chips, for instance, require lots of water. That could be at the expense of farmers. How do you have people at a local level working together on getting to that sustainable circular economy?
I have two more questions before we end. One is, what you have been in touch with some of the young people, high school students of Taiwan, and college students and young men and women in Taiwan as well. If you want to encourage them in this time of uncertainty, what would be the thing that you want to tell them that at this early stage of life, what you need to do to really build yourself up?
So it's been really nice meeting young people during this trip and having discussions with them. And what struck me as well in these discussions is how polarized society is in Taiwan. And lots of times when you talk about things, there's automatically a sense of opposition, not people working together on common endeavor. And it's quite draining if you feel you can't do anything because the politics is so polarizing. But I think we all have agency, and it's seeing where you do have agency. And one of the most remarkable people I've met is a young man called Ipo, who's a Yale World Fellow from Rwanda. And when he was a boy, age 7, it was the time of the Rwandan genocide. And he witnessed his father murdered in front of him. And, you know, for years, he thought about how to revenge his father's death. But he realized that that desire for revenge, that anger, that hatred of others was really eating him. And it was really damaging to him. And he has created this whole movement about being the peace, that you can actually be the peace. So rather than seeking revenge, you can go to your perpetrator and have a discussion. And I visited him last year in Kigali in Rwanda. And he's got all these initiatives that he does that brings people together, victims and perpetrators, in common endeavor. That they work together doing gardens together. That they might look after animals together. And so visiting Rwanda for me was a really amazing experience. And I learned that in that country, on the last Saturday of every month, everybody gets a text telling them where they're to go for their community service. And so for one Friday, last Saturday of each month, Rwandans will turn up in different places to do community service. And they'll do community service with people they don't know. And so it's part of a common endeavor. You might be building a wall or clearing a park. You're doing something together. And I think that idea of reconciliation begins at home. And for the contacts or the conversations I've had since I've been here, it's what initiatives can be done that really spur that sense of empowerment. And so again, I go back to climate. It's something that young people on this island can be working on together all the time. It's, you know, it's a passion of young people in other countries. It's a way that brings people together because our differences are minor. What we have in common is so much greater. And so for young people, I'd think spend more time on what it is that you can do together and not feel disempowered because of the messy politics. There are things that you can do that build resilience, that give you joy, and that make for a healthier and happier society in Taiwan.
Yes, to bridge divides and to be committed and to make an effort in your community and to create to initiate dialogues and so on. Well, you have noticed how divided our society is. Wherever you go, whichever topic you will cover, that is the case. I just wonder, well, this is probably one of the major tasks for the Taiwanese to really overcome this divide. You once mentioned to me that you believe that no island is an island, but Taiwan is an island. You know, my generation, we grew up isolated on an island. We, as children, we did not just cheerfully go to the beach and play on the beach, because on the beaches there might be the frogmen with the dagger between the teeth, and they will sneak up and they will attack you. So this is the way we grew up. There's a kind of isolation as no bridge over the strait to your enemies. And somehow, after the martial law was lifted, supposedly we earned our freedom and liberation. However, nowadays we are getting into another kind of isolation. And then it seems that climate change, the efforts, because we have a common enemy that is climate change, and we're all Homo sapiens, so we should be all on the same boat. Actually, the political divide becomes very insignificant when we are faced with this major challenge to mankind. But the people here sitting in this room, and also when your presentation talk is aired on the net, then we have audiences from China, from Malaysia, from Hong Kong will be watching our talk. Emma, would you say something, actually not just to the Taiwanese people here, but to people from different regions, about the concept of initiate dialogues and overcome divides, and no islands in the island?
I mean, I truly believe no island is an island today. We're all connected. We're connected by the threats that we face, whether it's climate change or artificial intelligence getting way ahead of any form of regulation. We saw how connected we were during COVID. So we're all on this earth together, and the transnational challenges require cooperation. I think a lot of the time that I've been in Taiwan, I've heard a lot of people talk about the past. But it's important not to be slaves to the past. I've heard fewer people give a vision of the future. And I think with all the amazing innovation and the tech here, Taiwan has a lot to contribute to the world, a lot to contribute to addressing some of these challenges that the world faces. So I think, the challenge of leadership in any country is to provide that optimistic vision for the future. If you don't have that, then you just polarize and say it's their fault, it's their fault, it's their fault. Well, funnily enough, that doesn't help address the problems that we're facing. And so I think everyone has got to be thinking, what is that optimistic future that you seek? And then work backwards to deliberately plan how you're going to get there. And yes, we have these geopolitical tensions, these geopolitical rivalries. But every place also has agency, not just helpless pawns in all of this. So you think, how do you use your agency to determine your future, and how to build the resilience to ride the storm of this competition? And I think, the focus is, or should be, on how to build peace. And peace doesn't come from passivity. Peace requires vision. It requires tremendous amounts of hard work. And it requires a willingness to listen, to find the compromise. So it requires everyone around the world. It requires everyone in the room and everyone who is listening to this speech. So thank you.
About peace building, exactly here. If you were faced today, if this were not in Taipei, but you were in Beijing, speaking with 150 people from China, would your conclusion be the same or slightly different because they are a great power?
When I was in China last week, we had similar discussions, and young people there looking at what it is that they can do to contribute to make the world more peaceful. And funnily enough, I didn't find much difference between the young people there and the young people here, or the young people I teach in America.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you. Thank you. We leave more time for the audience to raise your questions. May I ask you to be, first of all, very brief with your question so that we'll get a bunch of diverse questions. And secondly, please very briefly tell us who you are so that we get an idea the diversity of the people in this room. And then I would say that Emma can take any challenging questions, as long as it's precise and brief and to the point, okay? So who will be the first, please? Can we take 3 at one time, all right? So 1, 2, 3. Okay, the first bunch. Okay, please. The lady first, please.
So thank you very much for the insightful presentation and sharing. It's really an honor to be here today and listen to the dialogue. So myself, I am a college student studying law, and I'm also looking to study in Yale for my grad school. And I really agree with the point that sustainable ability would never be reached without peace and international cooperation. I want to also thank you for the piece of advice, since I'm also one of the young people that sometimes feel powerless because of the chaotic politics. And my question is that as a law student, speaking about peace and climate change, the first thing that comes to my mind is an ICJ case back in 2010, naming certain activities carried out by Nicaragua in the border area, Costa Rica versus Nicaragua. And in that case, Costa Rica tried to resolve its conflicts with Nicaragua through biodiversity litigation. And we can all see that climate litigation has been surging rapidly. So the question is that, what do you think about cases like this one? Do you think like resolving geopolitical questions and conflicts by biodiversity and climate change litigation is possible? Or what would the ICJ plays a role in the international peace and cooperation in the future? Thank you very much.
Excellent. Okay, the gentleman, please. Yes, in black. In black.
Hello, my name is Andres. That's spelled A-N-D-R-E-S. I was the American who a few months ago was at Kuting MRT saying "Free Palestine, ceasefire now." And Professor Sky, you talked about listening. Well, nobody listened to me when I did that. Instead, seven police officers carried me out, literally carried me out of the MRT. And no one in the local media, mainstream, wanted to talk to me about that. Nobody was listening to me. And a local YouTuber interviewed me, but then he said, Andres, I can't post your interview because that will hurt my channel. So again, there is a lack of listening. And also very quickly, you said Iraq failed and the state collapsed. Yeah, because my government destroyed it. So the question, my first question then is, what do we do about the lack of listening here? Secondly, you agree that my government should not have destroyed Iraq in the first place. And finally, 35,000 Palestinians have died since October 8th. That's over 30 times as many Israelis died on 7 October. So you agree also, Professor Kim, that Professor Sky, that cease fire now. No matter what you think about Israel, cease fire now. So question one, what do we do about the lack of listening in Taiwan? Number two, you will go on the record today and say the US never should have invaded Iraq in the first place in 2003. And number three, cease fire now, free Palestine. There is only one solution, Intifada revolution.
Thank you, Andreas. The third is here, please. This lady here.
Short question. What do we do about the extremists? You mentioned the extremists who killed Rabin. There are extremists in China's government. There are people who arguably, certain people in the political establishment here would argue are extremists in Taiwan's political landscape. How do we work with those extremists, even when there is consensus among the average people?
Great. Okay.
So thank you for those questions. On climate litigation, I think there's some really interesting cases that have been brought. You mentioned one in Latin America. There's another one in Pakistan. And these have been groundbreaking. In Pakistan, you had an individual who took the government to court for not providing safe air. And it makes governments respond. And so people are looking at legislation in one country and the impact that it can have globally. So I'm very pleased that you're looking at that. And I think it's a really interesting area to go into. So if you're studying law, look at what you can do with environmental law. On Andre's question, yes, the US should never have invaded Iraq. It was based on the assumption that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, which he didn't have. And you can only really understand the Iraq War in the aftermath of 9/11 and that fear of another attack. So America invaded Afghanistan, which was where Al-Qaeda was based, and from where the attacks on America had been planned. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11 at all. And after the invasion of Iraq, the US dismissed the security forces and dissolved the state institutions, which led to the collapse of the state and the civil war. On your question on what is happening in Gaza, it's awful what is happening. I think all of us watching what is happening there really are horrified by what happens. And I think we all hope and urge governments to push for a ceasefire with all the hostages released and a rebuilding of Gaza, which doesn't have Hamas still in control of the Strip. And it's difficult to do. It is difficult to do. The news today seems to be suggesting that we're getting closer to that deal. And let us hope, for the sake of everyone who lives in Gaza and everyone who lives in Israel and in Lebanon and in Jordan, that this war comes to an end soon. On the question of extremism, I think it's really important for us all to be aware that good guys outnumber bad guys. The trouble is, bad guys are very active. And I think it's, on all of us, we need to use our voices to be more active. Before, you might have had just a few crazy guys in the cupboard. And now what's happened with social media, with the internet, is crazy guys can find each other and their voices get amplified. And because social media tends to uplift the most radical and noisy voices, it can make you feel that the bad guys are more than they are. I think one of the very interesting things about Taiwan developing this Polis platform was you had a way of uplifting the voices where there was consent and quietening the voices which are the most extreme and shrill voices. And I think, how can you use that type of thinking and that type of technology to help build more consensus? Because actually most people are in the center. And if most people actually sat down and listened to each other, then they would realize there's nothing to be fearful. And they could work much harder together towards a common future.
Okay, thank you. I also want to encourage our senior guests here. We have military experts here. We have climate change experts here. We have mainland affair experts here. So I encourage you that you also, well, raise your hand if you have something to say, okay? So the next three, let me see, I will pick people farther away. Okay, this gentleman with glasses standing there, you don't have a seat, number one. And number two, the one in the black shirt. And wait, I will come to you, okay? Okay, be patient, be patient. And number three is the one, a gentleman who is still raising your hand here. And since you are so passionate, you'll be on the next round, okay? 1, 2, 3, please. And Andreas, there's a lot of media here today.
Hi, Professor Sky, it's Mark again. So anyway, after our interview, I asked you about, I think we all understand the importance of peace game, but I want something more concrete from you. What if Taiwan or China are playing this peace game? What would be their first step? What would be your suggestion? The first step, like maybe having a meeting in Singapore, or anything like that, something more concrete. Do you think? And also, I asked you about maybe making a suggestion to our new president, but of course, you said that the dialogue is important. But what if now you're standing maybe across, maybe you can talk to Xi Jinping, then what would you suggest Xi Jinping to do if we all want to complete the goal of peace? How do, is there any suggestion to Xi Jinping? Thank you.
The second one, please.
Professor Sky, I'm the student of Danjiang. I'm studying about international affairs and strategy. And my question is, we all know the global situation is there's two big countries, the US and China. And we all know there's media says Taiwan is one of the most dangerous places in the planet. But the issue is there's two big countries. They are maybe I should say competing to each other. So that would be a hard situation of Taiwan because we are between the two countries. What's in your opinion? I was touched when you said you are trying to end the conflict of the war. And what's your point about the conflict? What's the true conflict of two countries? I mean, the U.S. and the China. Is there any chance to end the conflict of these two countries, or at least decrease the conflict of two countries? What's the point of view of this question? Yeah.
Thank you. And the third, the gentleman.
Hello, Professor Sky. I am just a citizen in Taiwan, and I appreciate your outstanding speech. And I agree with remind me of President Reagan once say, peace through strength. Yeah, peace through strength. I think Taiwan, we have a lot of strategy, and we have a lot of opportunities. And through that, we strengthen our status in the globe. And we have a TSMC. We also call it Silicon Shield, as a very powerful and very influential around the world. And also we have our democracy society, and we also have some other. We also have our military strength. But what I want to ask is that is this, regardless of this kind of economy or military strength, is any other way or measures for us to strengthen our status, not even through the physical power, but we have other influential power like now economy, and all to show us that we have our voice, we have our status, that we as an independent country in the world. Is there any other strengths can strengthen our status? Thank you.
Okay.
So thank you for that. I think these 3 questions actually have a lot in common, so I'll try and answer them all together. Now, let me start by saying I'm not an expert on China, I'm not an expert on Taiwan. And what I have been trying subtly, and maybe too subtly, is to say that Taiwan has a lot of work that it needs to do on itself. So if you think this is a country which has great vulnerabilities, I've mentioned the vulnerabilities in energy security, water security, food security. I've mentioned the divisions within society. It's a polarized society. Some relate more to the mainland than others. So there's lots of polarization there. There's polarization in how people view the military. And so what I have been gently and maybe too subtly suggesting is ways in which you can build up a more resilient country to protect yourselves, to deter, if you like, but also to protect yourselves, and so that you can weather these stormy seas. You have the imagination of what is coming. I don't need to spell what might happen. You can think of different scenarios. So what is it that you can do as a society to strengthen your social cohesion? On peace gaming, so I'm trying to say peace gaming as a frame of cooperation. So rather than having a zero-sum war gaming, trying to look at how you can create games which is about cooperation. Now, if you're thinking of different sides, when you bring different sides together, and you can do this at a local level, right the way up to national level, you need to understand each other's positions, and you need to understand each other's interests. And as soon as I mention peace gaming, everyone's going into China, Taiwan, China, Taiwan. But I'm trying to help people think of a construct that you can use at all different levels of society. Having that vision of the world you want to live in, understanding the other's interests, so if you're private sector, or if you're a farmer, TSMC or a farmer, or if you're President Xi or President William Lai, to understand each other's positions, each other's interests, is really critical. So that's the sort of framing that I'm suggesting. And all around the world, you can see countries are taking action to de-risk. If you think of Germany, it was dependent on Russia for its oil supply. And it's had to de-risk and look at how it's going to get its energy elsewhere. So if you look at Taiwan and think all the vulnerabilities that you have, you need to address them. Because unless you address them, you're at high risk. And how are you going to weather all of this competition? And how are you going to weather climate change? They're the same issues that need to be addressed. It's about becoming, more social cohesion, more sustainable, more circular economy, these are all the same issues. And while I'm sort of talking out loud, you know, Taiwan prides itself on being a democracy. A messy democracy, a flourishing democracy, but a democracy. Now, democracy is supposed to be a marketplace of ideas that you debate and the best ideas come to the top. And then you implement, you take action on them. But if that's not happening, if people feel stuck, that they're not making any progress on this, I mean, 97% of energy imported, 2/3 of food imported. There's lots of work that needs to be done. And so how can you make your democracy work better? Democracy is not just about having elections. In the 20th century, we saw that democracy was the most successful form of government in giving security and prosperity to its people. In the 21st century, we've got other challenges, and it's not yet clear what is the best system of government to address these challenges. You know, America and China are competing to who's going to be the climate leader. They're both the biggest emitters of fossil fuels, of carbon. So they're both causing problems to our world. But they're both taking up the challenge of the green transition, how to reduce emissions, how to bring online new technologies. And all around the world, people will be looking at which country is leading better, that's helping to address those issues. So again, we're back to climate change. It's the biggest thing facing us. And Taiwan, with the ingenuity of its people, with all this experience of tech, how can you put that ingenuity to practice to show all of us how to get to a circular economy, sustainable? Because that is something you can do something about. When all the energies are spent discussing cross-strait relations but not doing anything about it, that energy could be applied much more to doing something that's really important, to looking at what more can Taiwan do on climate action? Can it work with climate activists on the mainland and around the world to help save our planet? And so to give human beings, you know, a 22nd century to live in.
Thank you, Emma. I think part of the frustration people here will feel is that from the politicians' point of view, it's easier to mobilize votes if you focus on China, Taiwan, China, Taiwan, China, Taiwan issue, political issues. And if you begin to talk about energy and our land, farming land, industry, and water resources and all that, it's harder work. It's harder for them to gain votes. So that's part of the reason why the frustration is felt here. But we like to have more questions. And I want to encourage you, if you prefer to ask your questions in Mandarin, it's perfectly fine in Chinese. It's perfectly fine. We have a wonderful interpreters right behind there. So feel free to do that. Now, this, the next round. So again, a gentleman in black, and this lady in black, and this lady in white. 1, 2, 3. Please, go ahead.
Hi, Emma. Welcome to Taiwan, and thanks for sharing. It's freaking awesome. Yeah, to be frankly. And all the questions. So
wait a minute, who are you?
I'm John, local here, working on to be a Mandarin teacher, and I want to use my talent to help more foreigners to learn Chinese. That's why I'm really into it. And all the folks are asking about, we're surrounding about the issue, peace. So is it possible for you to give a strong definition and elaborate more about it? Because I think we want it not to so be opaque. We want to make it concrete about what is peace. Yeah, it's kind of like a STEM question. Thank you. Cheers.
Okay, and the lady in black.
Okay, my name is Nini Yu. I work for a global company, but actually it's an Israeli company. And we have employee from Ukraine, from Russia. They're speaking Russian. And I have a lot of Israeli colleagues and Palestinian working with us. So 2 years ago, I lost 55 Ukrainian employees. So they don't talk to each other anymore. There's no peace, and there's no more peace whatsoever. And last year, I have hundreds of the Israeli colleagues. Now our reserves are in the world. And I don't know if you still believe two-peace solution, but I think peace is, no matter what we talk about, climate change is at a very personal level. Okay, they all are impact. So can you, speaking to all my Taiwanese employees here that are very young, and tell them what they can contribute to the peace? And because it seems like peace is all of their hands, all of their reach, and climate change is just something so far away from them.
Thank you, Nini. And the lady in white.
Good evening, Dr. Long and Dr. Sky. I'm Xin Zhang from National Zhenji University, a graduate student from political science. And I really appreciate the talk today, and I learned a lot. And thank you for your sharing. But I have some questions. How could we build do more effort in those cooperation in those climate change issues? But also we can ignore the energy competitions at the same times, because we can all know like climate issues and virus are transnational issues, especially during the pandemic. Although we enhance the cooperation about the energy resources, the green energy, critical mineral, however, we bring more, although we bring more peace for the world to have less renewable energy, however, they have some problem and risk, especially in those resource-rich countries, especially in those developing countries in Latin America or in Africa. So do you think that while we open the gate, especially in the economy, and they will bring like the threat of virus, is there a deglobalization is essential in part of sections? And the second, is there a win-win situations between those global north and global south? Although we have more dialogue, but they also have more unequal commitment and more false promise for those great power. Thank you for this. Thank you.
So thank you for those questions. Competition is inherent in society. It's inherent in human beings. We're competitive creatures. And the challenge in any society is to create the mechanisms or the institutions for that competition to take place non-violently. So I think non-violence is key to peace. And that's something we must always have in mind. And when you talked about having colleagues who are from Israel and Palestine and Ukraine and all of these places, at the end of the day, Israelis and Palestinians are not going to go away. So at the end of the day, there's still going to be Israelis and Palestinians. No matter how many wars that are fought, the wars come to an end, and people have to find ways of living together again. And it's much easier to reconcile before conflict than it is after conflict, because then you've got the horrors and the trauma and the grievances to deal with. Now, climate change is not far away. You know, in my short time in Taiwan, discussing with Professor Lee yesterday, like, where are the typhoons? They're missing. So you can see the water, the rains are coming in different ways. That's affecting the farmers. Today I was on the north coast looking at corals, And you think of all the corals that are being destroyed here by the warming waters. And that's affecting where fish live. Now, the question on renewable energies and what Taiwan should be doing, I'm actually going to pass the microphone to Professor Lee, because otherwise I'm just going to be repeating everything that he told me. And I think it's much better that it actually comes out of his mouth. So Professor Lee, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to pass the microphone to you.
I think we are talking about resilience, and we all mentioned about the war between China and Taiwan. Actually, there's more we have to talk about the relationship with the human being and the nature. Actually, that's more important. And in Taiwan, unfortunately, for the last 20 years, we have been separated by different political agenda, and we never talk. So actually, the dialogue is very important. We have to do the fact-finding. What happened to Taiwan? I think Emma just mentioned 97% of our energy are imported. And the current administration, we are going to rely on fossil fuel. You know how much we are going to rely on fossil fuel? 80%. 80% rely on fossil fuel that has to be transported. And thinking about the current situation, if China keeps surrounding, just have all the activity around Taiwan, within 7 days, we are out of gas. We are out of energy. That's something we have to really worry about. And also, our water supply in the past, we have 4.5 typhoon will come to Taiwan. And they bring 90% of water for central and southern Taiwan. For last 3 years, they never come. So this year, we are very concerned when will be the next typhoon. If they don't come, then we are in big trouble. And nowadays, we always say, oh, AI and all the Taijidian, all those fancy things that depends on two things: stable electricity, stable water, no war, low carbon footprint. And those are major four crises. Actually, we never talk. We never talk, and we never want to really do the fact finding. So actually, I've been discussed with Emma yesterday. We have to do one thing. We have to calculate the carrying capacity of our land. We have to know the limitation of the land. For example, the government said we have TSMC go to Kaohsiung. We want to have TSMC go to Jiayi. That's not possible because there's no water there. There's a consuming industry. So we have to do our homework. By doing our homework, of course, as an expert, yes, we know the answer. But we have to convey the message to all the people. Actually, we have to talk. We have to discuss. We have to dialogue. Dialogue is lacking in our culture. We never talk, we never understand, and we don't do the homework. We never do the calculation. A country like Taiwan, 70% of our water is allocated to agriculture. Actually, the number is not right. We should reallocate 20% of the farming water. We solve our water shortage problem. By reallocating 20% of our farming water, that means we have to release 20% of our land. Then goes to special planning, and then goes to another ministry. So easily, I would say 90% of Taiwan's problem are political problem, not technical problem. The engineer can only solve very simple problem, unfortunately. And also, I will emphasize two things: interdisciplinary dialogue. Different discipline experts, we have to talk with each other, and also interagency coordination. Any simple problem, go to the central government. At least there are 3 ministries involved. And we never talk to each other because that's not our culture. So I would say this, of course, it's very complicated. Peace, it will never be easy to solve. I will suggest we have to know ourselves first. We have to know our limitation and dialogue is very important. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Hongyuan. Well, since Emma has given the floor to Hongyuan, I really don't want to waste the expertise here. Emma, you know the Chinese character, written character for the word war or weapon, how it's written. That character has two compartments. One compartment is to stop, and the other compartment is weapon. Stop weapon is the word for the Chinese word for war or fight. All right. So in this room, we are talking about that we Taiwanese should become aware that we really have to shift in the defense of our country. Instead of talking only about the military and buying weapons from the US, we really have to strengthen our resilience in all these aspects. That's the major takeaway I hope that this room leaves. However, we have two admirals here. We have two admirals here who have organized war games and who have participated in the Washington War Games many times. And so I really like to hear their comments about what they heard today. Ethan and General Chen Yongkang and General Li Ximing, who would like to go first? I'm putting you on the spot. Ximing, please.
Yes, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. You know, you're talking a lot about peace, and I spent more than 4 decades to study on how to win a war. It is kind of a very conflict, but you really inspired me a lot about the peace. So I would like to throw some question about peace with you. And you mentioned about we are the dangerous place in the planet, and everybody knows that China's ultimate goal is to unify Taiwan, either with the peaceful way or forceful way. And Xi Jinping mentioned several times that the unification of Taiwan is a historical inevitability. So dialogue is very difficult. Also, the people promoting the dialogue would be regarded as kind of, I don't want to say this because I don't want to create hatred here. And my question is, what is I would like to know your perspective. What is the best strategy for China to unify Taiwan without fighting? Without fighting, okay? And the second question is, what is the best strategy for Taiwan secure all national with peaceful way? I would rather to hear your perspective in terms of the realism instead of the idealism. Okay.
Thank you, Ethan. Thank you. Emma? 等一下 Emma.
So as you said, that Beijing wants to win without fighting. And what is the best strategy for Beijing to do that? It would to appear more attractive, a more attractive society, a more attractive economy than Taiwan's. So if China's economy does better than Taiwan's, to attract people from Taiwan to want to go and work inside China, to flood the market with these apps that young people like to use. And you can already see lots of those apps apparent. So it is the attraction factor. I think there's also the fear that Beijing feels towards Taiwan's relationship with the US. And I think that often Beijing feels that the US seeks to undermine it and contain it and uses Taiwan to do that. So I think understanding why Taiwan is important to China is key, because I think there also might be other ways of solving the issues that we face. When you look at the world last century, you know, the nation state was predominant and the majority of people lived in the countryside. Today, we've seen migration of people all over the world towards cities. And the majority of people now live in cities rather than the countryside. And the challenges facing the world, AI, pandemics, climate change, are transnational. So I am thinking of a future that maybe the nation state might not continue to be the unit in which we are organized globally. We're already seeing that with transnational companies. And so I think for Taiwan, its strategy should really be to just try and maintain the status quo as long as possible into the future. Because as the world changes, these issues might become much less important. We've all got our digital footprint. I entered Beijing and the computer sees my nationality and so speaks to me in English. Somebody else was French and it was speaking to them in French. Someone else, like Italian, I'm spoken to in Italian. And when I left the country, it flashes up. I left on facial recognition, it flashes up, goodbye Emma Sky. And I thought, gosh, is this the techno world that we're moving into, where all our data is known by states and private companies, facial recognition everywhere? Do we move without passports? I think the world is really changing. And going to Beijing gave me a little glimpse of the technology that's coming. You know, they're much further ahead in their technology than, you know, I'm from the UK. And hearing that they're worried about demographics changing. They've got all this old population, and the pyramid is going that way. Who will look after the old population? So they're designing robots that will deliver room service. And then there's arms, like robotic arms that make your coffee for you. And so, you know, all of these things, the world is changing so rapidly. So the problem that you face here today might be just completely different in the years to come. It might not seem as it seems today. So I think the strategy for Taiwan has got to be maintaining the status quo and waiting for these changes that I think will take place. But for China, it's going to be winning without fighting. And again, that goes back to the social cohesion and resilience of Taiwan. Because a lot of things that Professor Lee was mentioning, that Taiwan really needs to do much more on. Because otherwise, it doesn't need an enemy. It's its own worst enemy. So that's the challenge.
Admiral Chen, I thought last year what you did was war gaming. Yes. And now I realize actually what you did was peace gaming. Please.
Thank you, Dr. Long, Emma. Actually, I was the original organizer for the largest scale tabletop exercise. Whether you call it a war game or peace game. In reality, first I want to thank the United States support Taiwan for decades with a good weapon system and a training program. But I promise you, we can win some battle under different condition scenario, but we cannot afford a war. The problem is during the past decades in Taiwan, we do not have a national security strategy. That's the headache. That's the problem, like Dr. Lee mentioned. We only have the top-down policy guidance. We do not have any horizontal interagency coordination. So when you ask the question for different department, no problem. No problem means the problem, because we cannot identify the problem between problems. There's no solution, because there's no best solution, only the better solution on the affordable cost. Time is limited, resource limited, manpower is limited. How can you react? So crisis prevention is more important than crisis management. So how to generate a coherent interagency coordination, generate a long-term strategy like the United States National Security Strategy. We do not have that. We copied your concept to publish the QDR every 4 years, but the United States canceled QDR since 2018. So this is a QDR in Taiwan. It's a propaganda papers. And every 2 years we publish, we so-called defense white paper, a 国防白皮书. You know, within that book, the topic focus on national defense policy, 2 pages. National military strategy, 2 pages. No guidance. Then you're asking how we can generate resiliency. I mean, using the armed forces, not instead of the 72 hours, can we resume the power supply, power grid, water supply, submarine cable, communication? Hundreds of headache issues. Can we, government, solve the problem in short term without NSS? That's the number 1 consideration. I provide you for comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Okay, there's one last expert here. I think Emma will be very interested. That is, there are many former ministers here, almost like 10 of them. And we probably will all complain, well, the inter-ministry communication was bad, okay? However, we also had ministers without portfolio who is responsible for communication between ministries. And we have such a former minister here. Not only that she was coordinating the problems between ministries, but she was also in charge of innovation and high-tech development. So we really like to listen to Jacqueline Tsai. Can we, as Emma said, well, with all kinds of innovation and high-tech, we could bridge the gap between China and Taiwan? Tsai Yiling.
Actually, for tech lawyer, I'm not that sort of the expecting better future because you know all the technology changes and so many things is out of our control. And for example, like we all enjoy technology like smartphone, social media, Facebook, IG. We do have dialogue, but we dialogue with the same group. We all believe what we heard. We all based on the information we are given to believe. So we do have a lot of different opinions, but it is hard to reach consensus because everyone believes what he heard and what he given to know. So that's the situation not just in Taiwan, but in the world. So cross-ministry, so-called the disagreement is really hard to solve. You know, when I was minister without portfolio. So that's the most challenging work, I would say, in my career life. But it's getting more and more of this need to be solved, not just by a single ministry, but have to, you know, deal with and solving by many, many ministries. That means we have to work together. Otherwise, the issue just cannot solve. So sometimes I would say, for a tech lawyer, solve the issues. Maybe not because maybe we cannot rely on law. It's too slow. We use technology maybe much, much efficient. So we need more tech people to solve problem for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you, Jacqueline. And the very last one, I'm not going to let him escape tonight, is he was also the minister in charge of economic development and across ministries, okay? And he was also the president of National Taiwan University. Zhongming, would you like to say something? No.
Thank you very much, Yingtai and Emma. And many people have already said about the dialogue. I think after learning what Emma said, I think one of the important things that we really need to do in Taiwan is to build up the dialogue within our own people. If we don't find any common ground within our own people, between parties, how can we find any common ground to talk to the other side or talk to engage the whole world? So it is important that for us to really open up our mind, willing to listen to somebody else and start to talk to each other to find a solution, like Professor Lee mentioned. If we never talk to each other, we probably never find a solution for that, and probably never find any progress within Taiwan or across the strait. That's my feeling. Thank you.
Thank you, Zhongming. Thank you, Zhongming. Emma, I'm tempted. I cannot let him go because this gentleman with white hair, beautiful white hair, he was in charge of mainland affairs. And so, actually, I have a personal question for you. He negotiated with China a lot. Suppose, can you imagine President Lai said, hey, Mr. Xi, why don't we sit down and let's talk about possible cooperations on climate change issues? What would happen if he did that? And reversely, if Mr. Xi comes up and said, let's work on that, climate change, water problems. Well, Jinmen and Mazu, the water comes from China. So is that a possibility at all?
Well, Emma, you mentioned earlier that you're not an expert on China, nor Taiwan, nor cross-strait, but I think you are just being humble. I know you know a lot.
She has become one.
But I think it takes one expert on China or in general terms to understand the very complicated situation between Taiwan and, across the strait. The history, not just ancient history, but particularly recent history since 1949 onward, and also the sanities, the new politics, the power politics between the U.S. and mainland China, all that. The question you asked, I don't think that's possible because we did have a dialogue before. I mean, in between 2008 and 2016, under the President Ma's administration, we had a dialogue with China. We had thousands, millions of visitors, even tens of thousands of students studying each other. So when you say work together, cooperation on projects like climate change, it's fine just among Taiwanese students or in China among Chinese students. But I think it's important to have a cooperation between the Chinese students on mainland and also the Taiwanese students. But the politics stopped them from coming to Taiwan and us for going to mainland China. The reason I say no, because there's a lack of common political ground to have such a dialogue. President Lai did mention that he wanted to have dinner with President Xi, and in year 2000, I think President Chen Shui-bian also mentioned he'd like to invite the then President Hu Jintao to have tea in Jinmen. It's like a wish list of all the politicians. But unfortunately, to the Chinese side, mainland Chinese side, they set it as a precondition about the one China. You agree that there's only one China in the world, and we talk. But to the political leadership here, the DPP basically say, if it's a item on the agenda, we can talk about it, but don't make it as a precondition of a dialogue. Unfortunately, they couldn't reach agreement yet. For the KMT, we solved that problem by an ambiguous term, which is controversial, 92 consensus, and then we have a dialogue and build up dialogue, good sort of mutual trust, mutual confidence, and hopefully one day in future we will be able to solve this insoluble question at the moment. As you said, maintain status quo for the moment for as long as it takes. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, because of the time limit, we have the last 3 questions. So raise your hand. Number one, this lady from Austria, and this gentleman in green, and next to you, please. So that's our last one. 1, 2, 3, please.
Good evening. My name is Gabriel Seewald. I'm from Austria, but I've lived in Taiwan for 15 years and in Greater China for almost 25 years. So I consider this my home. My children were born here. I teach regenerative circular economy at Furan Daxue. And through my own children and the students that I see very often here in universities, in schools, I keep hearing one thing from the young generation. Nobody is listening. Nobody is listening. Emma, you mentioned it a few times. I think to me it's something extremely powerful that we actually don't need anyone else to change or to do anything else first. But if my students and my children have taught me something that I'm hugely grateful for, it is to listen. To be able to listen what everyone has to say. Because everyone has to say something. And so often I see and I meet a room full of Taiwanese and foreign students. And the Taiwanese students, they do not dare to speak. They do not know how to speak. They do not know how to think and how to express what is in there. But in here and in here is so much of value, so much heart, so many good ideas, so much talent, so many gifts that we need now more than ever. So before I move to my question, here is first my invitation to all of us. Let us listen more. And let us invite, especially the young generation, to think, to express what they feel, their ideas, what they know, because there's so much here. But not only here, everywhere. I've lived in Beijing, I've lived in Guangzhou, I've lived in Hong Kong, I was born in Austria, I was raised in a family that gave me a chance to meet people from all over the world from an early age. And I consider this the greatest gift I received. Because, as you said, I had the chance to realize very early what unites us is so much more, so much greater than what divides us. And coming to my question now, what are the capacities you would say, Emma, we should support especially the young generation here in Taiwan, but everywhere in the world. What is the capacities we should be building, and we should support and teach and educate the young generation to build in order to create a sustainable, a healthy, and a peaceful society where we collaborate not only with each other, but with this amazing regenerative intelligence of this very planet we're very blessed to call home. Thank you,
Gabrielle. Thank you. And over there, please.
Hi, Emma. Glad to meet you one more time. I'm Joe. I'm a high school educator. So I think this is the first time for every one of you to listen to an educator, or maybe I shouldn't call myself an educator, maybe just a teacher. It's actually really uncommon to meet a lot of people right here. When I stepped into this room, I saw my students sitting in the back of this hall. I saw my colleagues here. I saw some of the interviewees I interviewed for National Education Radio. I spotted my, university, classmate doing the simultaneous interpretation in the booth. Everything is uncommon. My question has a lot to do with what I just talked about. Because in Taiwan, the students just listen to a teacher's monologue. In the past, we were educated to listen. Sometimes we don't listen, we just hear. One ear in, the other ear out. But today, I want to address the same question one more time. We don't just want to teach our students to do trash talk. We want a meaningful, uncommon dialogue, because today it's about uncommon. How do we, somehow engage our students or educate our students to initiate an uncommon dialogue, because they have already done a lot of common dialogues. They talk all the time, including in their classes. And also how to educate them to empathize with others and appreciate perspectives. Back to square one, because in our high school national defense textbooks or classes, we only teach them the history of war. And also, our students joined a lot of shooting drills and then did a lot of air raid, somehow drills as well to state, we have to pay attention to the alert as well at the same time. So what can we do for the above things we mentioned earlier? And that's what I want to do. And that's what I want to learn from you, because you also teach Yale students about these. Thank you so much. Cheers.
Thank you. Gentleman next to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. It has been a very exciting evening. So I'll proceed from listening and then dialogue. My name is Sakwe Collins Yimovie. I'm an academic. I'm in the International Doctoral Program in Asia Pacific, IDAS, NCCU. So my question will come with a brief comment, like an observation. So from all the discourse so far, I think it is possible to highlight the fact that the modern peace idea you've been speaking of, the idea of peace, especially the rule-based order itself, tends to draw from an ontology that has promoted the idea of competitiveness as an inherent characteristics of the human nature. I think if we continue to approach peace from this point of view, I'm wondering if the peace we are talking of is not still going to revolve or return back to what we've been talking about as dialogue, which in reality has been monologue. Because when we keep talking of peace, and then the peace, it's based on a rule-based international order, whereby we see incidents happen across the globe, but are interpreted differently to mean peace mean different things to different people. So that, for instance, what is happening in Gaza today, and then even with a rule-based international organization like the ICJ coming out to make a declaration, it is now interpreted by some quarters to mean trash within the rule-based order. That is problematizing the idea of peace. So what kind of peace are we actually talking about if we don't make a critique of the rule-based order that have brought us here? I'm speaking from the point of view because I'm relatively new in Taiwan. I'm roughly a year in Taiwan. So my second question draws from this, that this rule-based order, for instance, gave birth to WTO, right? WTO, China was gradually guided into WTO, and then the rise of China operating within WTO has expanded the global economy. This emergence of China seems to constitute some kind of threat to some interest around the world. And then it is that threat that is now reflecting with Taiwan in the center of this two-power contest, still drawing from that ontology of competition. But when you check around, is human really, are we competitive or we are cooperative? When we check the history of humanity up to this point, we spend more time cooperating other than competing. So why do we keep advancing this idea of competitiveness? And then we keep talking of dialogue. We are monologuing, we are not discussing because we are not listening to each other. So my question is, how do you reconcile this in developing a peace that is distinct from this war idea that we keep pushing forward as peace, that keep oscillating the world? Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, those are big questions, and I'm not sure I can do them all justice. As humans, our superpower is our ability to tell stories, to create a narrative, and our superpower is the ability to cooperate. You see ants, you see humans, that we're able to cooperate. Now, this gives us the opportunity to create a new narrative about the world. The narrative of the rules-based international order came out of World War II. It was an American vision, and it reflected the balance of power at that time. Today, in the 21st century, the balance of power has changed. The old colonial powers, Britain and France, are no longer the superpowers that they once were. And so that challenge of what's the new narrative that we can tell, that we can create, that we can inspire with. And that new narrative, I think, is still yet to be born. Going back to the point of listening, including particularly young people, I go back to this thing of peace gaming. We've been speaking about analog versions at all different levels, but you can also imagine online peace gaming. Kids spend a lot of time online gaming, and a lot of the gaming is about winning. It's about shooting. It's about conquering. It's about, you know, it's that sort of zero-sum type construct. Now, can we think more about peace gaming as cooperation? All the things I was talking before about climate, addressing climate, requires us to cooperate. And if you set, what are the incentives for cooperation? What does success look like in cooperating? Could it be your individual carbon footprint? Could it be the carbon credits that you've collected? Can you set a game where it's incentivized to cooperate with others? And so, you know, it's one of the reasons I'm in Taiwan. You guys are really good at this sort of stuff. You're good at developing these kind of platforms. So you imagine getting this game that takes off like Fortnite or Call of Duty, that millions of kids are playing everywhere. And through it, it's also a form of social engineering. They're learning about climate, they're learning about what needs to be done, and they know they have to cooperate. You can't just clear the sky above your island. You've got to be working all over the world to do this. And sometimes the countries that have contributed the least to global warming are the countries that are suffering the most. And so the question you asked about empathy, I also find that through gaming, through role play, it's a really good way of developing empathy. Get somebody to stand in someone else's shoes. Do you have a gaming where you play, okay, I'm going to be a government official, I'm going to be a farmer, I'm going to be a TSMC, I'm going to be an environmentalist. You could have all these different roles that people play. And you've got to connect with them in different countries. You can develop something really powerful, something that people of all different generations want to play. Have your experts, and we've heard from a few experts in this room, like Professor Lee, that you could consult, you could bring them in, you could end up with citizens' assemblies, selected like you select juries, you bring in the experts, you listen to the evidence, and then you make the trade-offs. You actually decide, we need to increase the price of water because that is the way we'll get people to conserve water more, and we will subsidize the poorest in society. And when you put together citizens' assemblies, they're often much more capable than parliaments at actually reaching these compromises. So some of the challenges facing a country like Taiwan are really difficult. And you need to treat the citizens as adults and get them, help them understand the issue and help them come to terms with the trade-offs that need to be made for the good of communities, for the good of society. So I think there's a lot that can be done through peace gaming, whether it's in person in communities, getting all the stakeholders together, or whether it's online gaming. You can develop something that's appealing to young people, and it can have real value in the real world, not just in the virtual world. So these are the challenges I put to all of you here today, that how do we do this? How do we use the human power of telling the narrative of why we exist, the world that we want to live in, a world where every child, no matter where they're born, is able to prosper, is able to live in security, is able to live in peace? How do we set the incentives for cooperation? Because that's our innate superpower. Competition could be positive because you think, hey, I'm going to improve how fast I run because I want to beat that person. So if you can set these positive competitions that allows human beings to aspire to even more greater things, and not negative competition, which turns into conflict and violent conflict. So these are the challenges on all of us to think more about. And as somebody wise said, strategy is far too important to be left to generals or admirals. So it's on citizens and it's on young people to imagine a better world and go out there and create it.
I think this visit of Emma Sky is a very significant one. If we look back later on, I think we all remember, all of us, what we have gone through. Actually, the 23 million people here have lived under 38 years of martial law. Let's not forget that. the people here, we have lived under the shadow of war for 70 years, more than 70 years. And only with newly earned democracy that we have been trying hard to find a new positioning for ourselves to move forward. And with this background understanding, I think we probably could be more compassionate about ourselves, that with our weaknesses, that we're not doing well, that we are so divided, and then we fight and squabble every day. We fight against each other. Well, we have had such a difficult history together. And I think Emma has come today to remind us that we all probably feel frustrated with this uncertainty for such a long time. 75 years is a long time. Emma, I think, at least me, reminded me really that we could easily feel isolated, not listened to, without any bridge to cross this very unpleasant divide. However, the reminder is that we really should look forward to the future. Me personally, I was so happy to see so many young faces here. Wow, you are beautiful. And the adults here, well, we consider us adults, also beautiful. Now, we have gone through so many decades of frustrations, international isolations, and the uncertainty. Therefore, it is easy for us and understandable that we feel disempowered, is that the word? And disillusioned. But then when you are disillusioned, then you lose the power and motivation to act. So I am very thankful that, including myself personally, I often feel disillusioned and wonder, well, all the efforts, what for? But that is the type of thing that Emma is reminding me and ourselves that, well, what's the way forward? No matter what, the adults, we have to fight against this disillusionment, and the younger people just have to be very bold and move forward, because that's where the future is. So Emma is reminding us that in the world divided by conflict and misunderstanding and even animosity, we have to believe it is possible to build bridge, foster dialogue, and create a more just and peaceful world. So Emma, I thank you so very much for bringing this fresh air, and maybe we find our way forward. Do come back. Let's give the warmest applause to Emma. Thank you so much.